Okay, this week I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to talk to Chris Lowis. I first ran into his work on a podcast that I listen to. I have sort of like a little obsession with listening to podcasts about JavaScript. Now, if that seems odd, you just don't know me very well, because that's right up my alley. But anyway, I listen to these podcasts about JavaScript technologies, and they had one about web audio, the web audio API and web audio technology. And one of the people they had on was Chris Lowis. He was very fascinating. He's got his fingers in on a lot of things, and so I reached out. He was willing to talk to us, and so with that, I give you this week's podcast, and let me talk to him now. Hey, Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Darwin. Nice to speak to you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk to me. I'm sure you are as busy as all get out.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's start off by just having you describe a little bit about the work that you do, and particularly how the different ways that you're sort of like invested in the web audio technologies.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I can talk a little bit about how I came to be working with web audio. So I've always been interested in kind of music technology. Music. I did a degree in acoustics and signal processing at the University of Southampton here in the UK, and I've kind of always loved playing around with computer music in particular, and kind of synthesis and those sort of things. I worked as a researcher there at the university for a while on kind of aircraft engine noise, and I decided that academia wasn't really working out for me, and I ended up applying for a job at the BBC. And I joined the BBC working on music projects, the music website, a website for unsigned bands, and those kinds of things, kind of as a programmer. And while I was there, we heard from the W3C. So this is the World Wide Web Consortium. They're the international organization sort of set up by Tim Berners-Lee that standardizes technology for the web, kind of makes sure that websites work across all browsers and that we kind of have standard technologies. And they'd sort of identified that doing things with sound and music and synthesis, and there wasn't really a kind of a web standard that would allow you to do that kind of work. And both Google and Mozilla had some proposals that they wanted to work on that were designed to improve that. And so we set up what was called an interest group, and the BBC was asked to join, I guess because we were kind of heavy users of that kind of technology. We had the ability to kind of work in public on these things, and we were sort of an interested outsider from the point of view of kind of people who make browsers, so kind of a sort of neutral third party.
Right.
And so while I was working at the BBC, I then moved to the research and development department at the BBC. So the BBC has sort of about 130 people who work in kind of R&D, and I was then co-chairing this working group, helping to standardize technologies that have become what we now know as the Web Audio API and the Web MIDI API. And then while I was at the BBC, I was kind of building some interesting things, writing about web audio, kind of evangelizing it a bit, trying to get developers involved to help stress test the API and see if it was fit for purpose, feeding in use cases, those kind of things. That was sort of my role there. And so I did a couple of interesting projects that used web audio. And when I eventually left the BBC, I've carried on my kind of involvement with the working group. I'm an invited expert on that group, although I contribute a lot less now than I used to do. But I've really kept up sort of my interest in it from a evangelism point of view, and so I write about web audio on my blog for fun, and I also write a newsletter that sometimes comes out every week where I kind of share interesting things that are happening in the world of web audio that are sort of interesting to programmers and musicians and technologists.
Well, that's a very interesting story, and kind of an interesting way to get pulled into that. So you say that you have a blog, you have a newsletter. You also are like active. There's like a Slack channel for people that are into web audio too, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, there is. Web audio Slack channel. we can add the links to your notes when you
Yeah,
make them.
sure. I'll put up some. I'll put up some link notes on the site so that people can track that. Because my suspicion is once people get into this a little bit, they're going to find out what a kind of deep subject area it is. I've been really surprised. Just this last week, I saw someone had posted a very complete and very significant bit of FM synthesis emulation that was really quite stunning. But it's sometimes it's instruments, sometimes it's kind of game-like things or like playing with audio. Of the things that are out there that you've seen, what's kind of captured your attention the most? Do you find it more interesting to see these people that are designing instruments, or are you more interested in the people that are finding ways to like make games or other ways for sort of like simplified interaction with web audio?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think very early on in the process, we were sort of looking for use cases and examples of the kinds of things that people wanted to do with audio on the web, and gaming was definitely like a strong use case. So having low latency sound effects that you can trigger in synchronization with what's happening on the screen and those kinds of ideas. Doing spatialization, virtual acoustics, that you can make things sound like they're in the virtual environment that you can see. I think also the idea of collaborative instruments or music making equipment is a kind of a strong use case that people want. So, could you take something like Ableton Live and put that in the browser and make it a kind of Google Docs style collaborative editing, sort of music editing environment or something, like very, very stretching use cases. I mean, I would say that, so one of the challenges that you have with kind of technologies on the web is this idea that they're kind of cross-browser. So we want these things to work no matter what web browser you're using. So
Right.
Whether that be Google Chrome, Internet Explorer, Firefox, Safari on iOS devices, and those kinds of things. And so I think quite a lot of the use cases that are maybe more simple are still to come, almost, in that now that people are happy that web audio is being adopted and it's available in all the major browsers, then people can start using it without having to worry about falling back to other things.
Right.
So I think one of the interesting things is that, like with a lot of kind of cutting edge technology, the people that get involved in it early on are like the real enthusiasts. They're the people that are prepared to kind of dig into something that's maybe not very well documented yet, dig their way through the spec to try and work out how things work, deal with things changing under their feet. And so a lot of those people have been building applications that really push the limits, almost, like so things like FM synthesizers in the browser, like you said, kind of collaborative music making, and so a lot of synthesis applications actually. And so I think a lot of the applications that you can see out there that use web audio tend to look like instruments and be synthesis, but I think that's an artifact of kind of the people who've been building things and working on things now, and not necessarily reflective of what the technology is capable for. So
sure, of course.
To do. So I'm really interested in kind of educational side of web audio. So, often an interactive document is the best way to teach someone. If I imagined some of the textbooks that I used when I was at university, if there was a little widget there in the text with a little slider that I could move and hear how the sound changes as something happens, that would have helped me understand like what I was learning so much quicker. And so those use cases are actually quite simple, but there's some of the things that I get really excited about.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
And I mean, the interesting thing from the web point of view is that the barrier to entry for people getting involved in things is really low. So I think one of the things that I get very excited about is people who are getting into doing things with synthesis or doing things with music and sound, who are maybe coming at it without any of the background, and so they probably wouldn't have got over the learning curve associated with Max MSP or Pure Data or Ableton Live even, but they can open a web page, be dropped into an environment where they can start kind of playing around with things that are really quite sophisticated.
Sure. That's awesome. I'm going to want to come back to this because I think you kind of opened up a really interesting door there. But before we go there, What I would like to know is a little more about your background. I'm always fascinated by people who kind of have interests in both highly technical areas like coding and highly artistic areas like sound. I always find it interesting to talk to these people and find out where they're coming from, because sometimes, they come from a real strong sound background and they got into coding. Sometimes the opposite. Sometimes they met somebody who did both and found their lives fascinating. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you got to be where you're at. Did you come at it first from a technical standpoint or first from a music or a sound standpoint?
I studied at university looking at kind of acoustics and signal processing, and I got quite interested in kind of experimental techniques for learning things about physical processes by measuring the sound that they make. So I spent a couple of years working as a researcher at the German Aerospace Center, which is kind of the German equivalent of NASA. Okay. And we had some projects to do imaging of aircraft as they flew overhead to try and work out where on the aircraft noise was coming from. And so you lay out a huge array of microphones on an airfield somewhere, and you fly an aeroplane over it. And then you can do something that's a little bit like radar. They call it beamforming, where you kind of add the signals together from all those microphones in phase, and you can kind of focus them like a camera on a particular point on the aircraft as it flies over. And that helps you to see, where is there noise coming from the undercarriage that we weren't expecting, or holes in, ventilation holes in the wings or whatever. And so I did various research projects around that kind of aspect, and that kind of involves taking acoustic data, but also like writing quite a lot of software to process that data, and usually end up with a lot of it. So kind of processing it quickly is quite important and efficiently. And so I kind of got into programming to help me better do my job in terms of analyzing these experimental data that I was working with. And then I sort of moved on to doing kind of simulations so that I could do experiments in the computer to develop new techniques and that kind of thing. So I kind of got into programming through that kind of work. But I had a long-standing sort of fascination with the web. I guess I was around at the right time, and so when the first browsers became available in the mid-90s and I was a teenager, like just this idea that you could write something and publish it on the web was very, very exciting to me. I was very much into kind of DIY culture and punk music and fanzines and all those kind of things when I was a teenager, and this idea that you could just write some code and then the whole world could see it and you could kind of share your thoughts on the web was very fascinating to me, and I sort of never let that go really. So I'd always sort of played a little bit with websites and web technologies, and so I guess I just followed those two interests in parallel really.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, it's interesting too that you bring up sort of like this DIY and punk mentality, because I too remember when web browsers and those things first started coming up, and the idea that you could just sort of like chuck something out there and get feedback from someone literally across the world was amazing, given that prior to that we had done fanzines that us and 20 other people would share, So
exactly.
It's a very different way of building an audience, I think.
Yeah, but also free of the restrictions that you have when you write a zine or put out your own record on your own record label or play in a band. You can just go and do it, and the web sort of allowed publishing that anyone could do. I mean, I think that still exists to a certain extent, but I think where the web's moved on and a lot more people are using it and it's a lot more commercialized, and most people don't worry about writing HTML and hosting their own websites and doing those kind of things. They post their thoughts and share their thoughts on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But yeah, I feel like the spirit that all of this stuff came from is kind of has lots of parallels in various kinds of music subcultures.
Yeah, absolutely. The web audio system that is sort of encapsulated by the web audio API actually has kind of had a quite a history, because there have been a lot of different movements towards doing that. Because prior to them trying this, everything was sort of like brokered by third parties. You would have music player systems like the Rhapsody plugins or whatever, or you would have Flash-based things, which I think was the primary means that people used, and then Java had some musical stuff wedged in, but everything was, I don't know. It seemed like everything was a real kludge, and so this seemed to be the first mechanism by which the goal was to say, let's make this part of working with standard web techniques rather than having to buy someone else's technology idea, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think what the Web Audio API has is it's a system. It's a system that I think some of your audience will be familiar with. It's a kind of a graph-based, declarative language, effectively, for kind of processing sound using nodes that you connect together. And Chris Rogers, who was one of the developers at Google, who kind of developed a lot of the early ideas for what's become the Web Audio API, he very much modeled the design of the API on systems like Super Collider and Max MSP. And he actually, I mean, he had a background in that, so he'd worked at Apple on what became Core Audio when OS X came out, and he was working alongside a gentleman who developed Super Collider, and so they were both there. So he had that lineage, and he'd also been at ERCAM in Paris at the research center there, sort of electronic music research center there, and had worked on Max and those kind of things. So he was coming at the design of the Web Audio API very much from a lineage that kind of stretches all the way back to, Max Matthews' early experiments with computer music in the 60s, and that the idea that as a programmer I don't worry too much about working with each individual sample and how to kind of manipulate audio at that sample level. I just say, okay, I have a stream of audio here that's been generated by an oscillator or is coming in from my computer's microphone, and I want to pass that through a delay line and into a kind of a spatialization node that will position it in virtual space, and then through a compressor so it doesn't blow my speakers, and you connect these things together. And the connection language that we use, the glue that glues these blocks together, is JavaScript. And but you're working at really quite a high level in JavaScript and building these graphs of audio processing by kind of issuing JavaScript commands. And what that does is that allows the browser to offload a lot of the computation, so the heavy kind of audio processing that's happening, to kind of low-level, highly optimized code that means that it can run on low-powered devices like mobile phones and so on, and be optimized for those in a way that I guess we always struggled with Flash and Java and some of those kind of virtual machines that sit on top of the browser.
Right. Now, it's interesting that you point out that it's sort of graph-oriented, because I think that there's two important parallel lines there. One is that, certainly as, being part of the development group of Max MSP, the concept of this graph-oriented audio systems is something that we think is a really natural thing because of its history in the computer music world. And you're right. I mean, so many of these systems rely on that core concept. But what's interesting to me is when I talk to users about stuff like that, they're not as compelled by the idea of a graph as being similar to other computer music systems. What they mostly think of is that, it's sort of like a guitar and a bunch of guitar pedals. And what's interesting is the extent to which the Web Audio API actually does sort of fulfill that role. It's got sources and modifiers that you can run things through, and it's a really pretty parallel vision of that kind of environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a useful analogy, and I've definitely experienced kind of firsthand what you're saying about people who come new to the Web Audio API. They're like, well, I thought I knew JavaScript, but now I'm in this world where I have to worry about, sample rate and compression, knees and thresholds and those kind of things. Like, what does all of this stuff mean? And you're kind of trying to bridge these two worlds between people who are kind of programming and maybe don't have the sort of the experience of working in computer music, but also the other way around, people who are used to other computer music systems or APIs that are out there and now have to kind of get their heads around JavaScript and the web and some of the limitations.
Right. Well, when I heard you on that JS Air thing, it was very clear that when you were talking about implementation of thing in JavaScript, they were just going along just fine. But when you started describing things like sample rates and stuff like that, they were a little bit boggled. And I think for people that spend a lot of time around media development tools, there's this whole glossary of things that just become second nature to us. Filter curves, oscillator waveforms, all these kinds of things become so embedded to us that we just assume anyone on the street understands all that stuff. And I think one of the things that this Web Audio API does is it actually exposes all of that stuff to a group of people who have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. And I think getting the design of the API right was very difficult and challenging. So we had suggestions early on and work that looked at, well, why don't we just provide a sample-based API? We can just have a very, very simple API that you just say, give me the stream of samples that are, that are being read in through an input device, or just let me modify that on the fly and output a stream of samples. And then everything else we can build on top in the JavaScript world as kind of libraries on top of it. Right. But you quite quickly kind of hit problems where even when you want to do something that's not particularly complicated but might involve let's make reverberation so that the sound in my game sounds like it's in a cave or wherever. Right. And you kind of want to do that on the fly, and you've got a whole load of convolution filters that you've been programming in JavaScript, trying to get them to run fast enough so that your latency is acceptable, and really just the environments are not ready yet. And so offloading that processing to kind of allow us to write the code at a higher level, but kind of offload the hard work to optimize code means that those things become possible, but then you're left with an API surface that's a lot more complicated. And I don't think in the design of the API that we ever really imagined that developers would be kind of compelled to learn the ins and outs of the Web Audio API itself. I mean, one of the things that JavaScript lets you do so easily is kind of wrap up some of these concepts in a higher level abstractions that you can then program with. And so there's starting to be libraries out there that are specifically targeted at game developers who can who can just think about things in languages that they're familiar with from other kind of game programming environments. JavaScript is also kind of a compile target, I think, for a lot of languages, so you can kind of write your game in one language, and then kind of the compiler takes care of turning that into Web Audio code for you, so you can kind of work in the environments you're used to. Or if you're building a sound experiment or a networked kind of instrument of some kind, there's libraries out there. I just wanted piano, give me a piano, and you just say new piano, and it loads up a multi-sample piano for you, and then you just say play C4 and off it goes, and so you don't have to worry about loading samples and mapping them across key ranges and mapping them to velocity and all those kind of things. Like, that stuff is abstracted away from you, and someone else has written the Web Audio code to do that. So getting these abstractions right when you design an API is very difficult. One of the real challenges, I think, with working in the web is the kind of, and doing audio applications, is the latency. And so browsers have had to really change the way that they've been architected to allow these kind of things with Web Audio, but some other technologies too. So you can offload the audio processing to a thread that's running in the browser's environment that has a higher priority, so that when I schedule up some events to happen, they will actually happen, even if the user is clicking and dragging and doing other things. And so you want the audio to kind of keep going and keep in time and have a predictable latency, even when there's lots of things happening on the website itself. And so that kind of abstraction is sort of taken care of for you, but it means that you have to learn some concepts in order to make the most use of it.
Right, that makes sense. Now, one of the things that, being a kind of a code geek, one of the things that I wonder immediately is, okay, there's this encapsulation layer. Because I know that at least at one time there was a way to make these nodes for the Web Audio written in JavaScript, and you could actually do that even though you knew you were buying into a performance hit. But that's kind of been deprecated, right?
Yeah, so there used to be something in the API. Well, it's still in there, but like you say, it's been deprecated, which was called a script processor node. And the idea was I could plug a node into my processing graph, and all that node would do is hand off block size, 128 samples at a time to some JavaScript code I wrote, and I could do whatever I liked with it. Mm-hmm. The challenge there was that code, that audio code that was being executed, the JavaScript that was being executed to modify those samples for various kind of technical reasons in the implementation of browsers, that stuff had to run in like the main thread of the browser where everything else is working, which was terrible for latency and predictability. So there's a new proposal which is kind of almost finished a specification of, which basically allows you to do that, but offload to put that code like on the audio thread and execute it with the same kind of latency semantics as the rest of the audio processing graph. And that's involved some fairly serious challenges around kind of security and those kinds of issues, I guess, when you're allowed to kind of execute code in somewhere else, if you like, somewhere outside of the regular kind of JavaScript runtime of the browser. And that stuff is close now to being agreed on as a specification, and I think implementations are kind of already underway with what's there. And so I think that's sort of what the working group at the W3C has sort of been saying is like the final piece of the puzzle before we can say, okay, we have a version 1 of the API now, and it's able to do all of the use cases that we hoped it would be able to do, even if you kind of have to write some of this audio processing code yourself. And I think that will really open up a lot of possibilities for people who want to do things.
Yeah, I think so, because other than that, there's not really a mechanism for people to make their own nodes, right?
No,
it's all built into the browser.
It's built into the browser, yeah. And so this will allow you to define your own nodes. And I guess the long-term ambition really is to move to a world where all of the nodes that kind of come like built in are defined in this way. And so there's a kind of consistency across all of them. So you can kind of unpack any of these built-in nodes, if you like, and kind of see the code that's running under the hood to make them work. That would be a neat kind of conceptual place to get to.
Yeah, well, that sounds really exciting, because one of the things I know from just playing with it, and to this point, that's all I've really done is I've played with it, but I've had a lot of fun. And also, I'd get into it, though, and I'd be like, well, what if I wanted to make my own wacky special thing? Because again, I have this history of doing that. And so making my own sort of like signature trashy sound node is something that I was curious about. So it's good to know that there's a movement in place to get that pulled together. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, I think from kind of computer music point of view, it's been really interesting for me to kind of look into techniques for recreating certain sounds using the building blocks that we do have, because there's a lot of power in them. You can look at one of the filter nodes and say, well, it doesn't have the roll-off that I want, but okay, it's a biquad filter, so maybe we can just chain 2 in series and play with the parameters to kind of design the sort of roll-off that I'd like. And it would be nice if you could specify an arbitrary order filter and create it, but you can kind of work around it if you sort of understand some of the principles, and so that's quite good. Yeah, right. That's quite good fun.
So when you're doing JavaScript coding for web audio, what, in your experience, what are the places where you experience limits? What are some of the limits? One of them that I noticed was that you're limited if you have a number of different audio interfaces. You're kind of limited into using just whatever the operating system exposes to the browser, right? What are the other sorts of limits that exist for people that want to dive into this?
So I think that is a limit. There's conceptually a way around that, which is about kind of having so all of your web audio graphs that you've built, they live in a thing called a context, and the context is what exposes the output channels for the particular interface that you're working with. So within the specification, there's nothing really to stop you having multiple audio interfaces that you can address with separate contexts. There's still some challenges to work out, like how do I move some of my subgraphs within one graph from one context to another? Can I share memory between the two? And then providing a user interface that allows you to kind of select and switch this stuff is being worked out. So that's sometimes a limitation. I mean, I would say most people don't hit it because they're typically addressing two channels on their, on their built-in sound card or laptop speakers or whatever. So for most people who want to use web audio, they don't hit that. But when you do want to do, maybe a DJ application I've seen which expects 4-channel output, for example, so that you can kind of queue and listen to tracks that you're queuing while you're playing something else out and kind of crossfade between them. That is a challenge, but there are ways to work around. And I think if people hit that, then kind of trying to make the working group aware of that, either through the working group's mailing list or the GitHub issues, would be really good. I mean, that's something where you can definitely contribute. I think interconnectivity between web audio and some of the web technologies is still being kind of thrashed out. So if you want to drop a video into a page and then somehow process the audio from that video through web audio, or if you want to stream the output of web audio using something like WebRTC, so you can kind of stream it to another computer, these things work, but they're at the boundaries of various teams' kind of responsibilities, and kind of getting to interoperate really neatly across lots of different browsers is still a kind of work in progress. So sometimes if you want to do those kind of things, that's a little bit tricky. Yes, a lot of people will write web audio applications and then be surprised that they don't work in like mobile Safari on iPads and iOS. And so there's some inconsistencies. Safari's implementation of the specification is a little bit behind some of the other browsers' implementation, so you kind of have to work out, okay, what have they done and what haven't they yet, and sort of code to detect the browser that someone's using to allow that to work seamlessly. And then various kind of permissions things on mobile phones, mobile devices, which is, so you can't just go to a web page and immediately make a sound without a user interaction or something like that. Some of those things catch people out.
Sure, I hadn't even thought about the mobile issues, but that's got to be the whole mobile thing has just really added a lot of complexity to dealing with web anything. So yeah,
absolutely. But also, a lot of amazing applications that you can do with it as well, which is exciting.
Well, and the reach to people is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I kind of, my sort of catchphrase with this is that you're only kind of you have a browser and you open up a developer console and you have a programmable synthesizer. I mean, you're 2 clicks away from the kind of programmable music environment that the people that were working on this in the John Chowning and Max Matthews would have kind of fallen over if they'd seen it. I think the sort of power and the immediacy that was available versus what they were working with. It's very, very exciting. I think there's various quirks of the Web Audio API that kind of catch people out. One that always catches people out is to help with memory management and garbage collection in the browser, so that you don't just use all of the memory that's available. Quite a lot of the nodes that you instantiate are sort of one-shot operations. So if you create an oscillator node and then you start it playing and it's generating a sine wave, and then you stop it playing and you think, I'll start it again, like I want to play another note, then you can't do that. You have to create a new node and reconnect it. And so that allows the old nodes that are connected to that part of the graph to be kind of garbage collected and tidied up.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that the newsletter thing that you do has sort of turned into kind of the default clearinghouse for new web audio stuff that's come through. So you actually get a chance to watch things kind of run past the front door of your house a little bit, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I get quite a lot of people that write to me and say, yeah, don't talk about this thing yet, but what do you think? I'm like, it looks great. Right. Let me know when I can talk about it. It's kind of, that's quite exciting.
So what is, of the things that you've seen, say, in the last couple of months, what's the thing that surprised you the most? So
I met a colleague of mine over in Google in Mountain View, who works on the worked on the web audio implementation for Google's Chrome browser. And this was a few weeks before they announced the kind of a new audio system for their virtual reality system, which is kind of web-based. You can write VR environments using web technologies, and they'd added a kind of binaural sound rendering to this, so that you put on the goggles and you kind of move your head around, and the sound is also kind of spatialized relative to what you're seeing. And that was all done with web audio and WebGL and those technologies. I mean, that's, opening up this, whole new world of technology to people that, well, if you can program a web page, you can also program a virtual reality environment using the same technology. I mean, that's incredible, really. In terms of sort of democratizing access to those kind of new environments. So that was very exciting. That stuff has kind of been launched now, but it was nice to get a taste for that early on. Yeah, that's the big one. I mean, I get a lot of things coming through that I guess I have to put my own lens on them a little bit. Like, so there's things that I like that, and so one of the things that I'm very interested in. So when people decide that they want to make a synthesizer using web audio, they'll kind of make a web page, they'll make the sounds using web audio, and then they will put browser-based knobs and sliders and things on there to make it look like a kind of 80s drum machine or a modular synthesizer or a mini Moog or something like that, which is really fun. I mean, it's, you've got this thing that looks like a synthesizer, and then you can kind of play it. But of course, it's not. There's better interfaces when you're using a computer to make music, and so I think one of the things that's been very exciting is the development of the web MIDI API. So this kind of development has happened in a working group, but sort of in parallel to web audio. And it's about, now if you've got Google Chrome, you can plug your MIDI keyboard in and immediately start reading MIDI messages from a controller. And that's taken off in a surprising way, really. So a couple of the big instrument manufacturers, Novation and Yamaha, with their latest synthesizers that they've released, hardware synthesizers, they don't need to ship a CD-ROM with that anymore that lets you kind of put some software on they just say, go to this web page and plug it in, and then it says, I can see it on your keyboard, and do you want to share this patch with your friend, and let's update the software, and let's download a new sound or a new sample or whatever, and that's all happening through the web. And that doesn't do synthesis of any kind in the browser, but it talks to musical instruments without requiring any kind of setup or those things, and that's that's already there, and they've they're sort of happy that it's production ready enough to ship it with with expensive commercial synthesizers. So that's incredibly exciting.
One of the things that I ran into a couple of years ago, because my wife is a school teacher, and she teaches some interesting media classes to students. And one of the things that we ran across in helping her prepare for school was this thing called WeVideo, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, a video editing suite that runs inside of a browser. Is there currently anything like that for using the web audio, or are people just starting to play with that sort of thing?
Yeah, there are some environments for doing that. There are a couple of applications out there for teaching people how to play the piano in the browser. So you can kind of connect your MIDI piano, and it will give you lessons, and you play along, and that's all using kind of browser technology. And there are a couple of kind of collaborative sort of 4-track type editors, GarageBand style in the browser, but where you can invite other people to contribute to your song, and you can all kind of add things and do things together. I'm struggling to recall the names of these things, but I can send them on to you. But but most of them I will have covered in my newsletter at one point or another, so people can find them in the archives.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I've definitely seen things like that, and I think the thing that people will say to me, okay, well, the browser will never be able to replace Pro Tools, or will never be able to replace Ableton or something like that. It will never be that powerful, and I think. I'm not 100% sure that I believe in that, because some of the things that browsers do today we would have never believed were possible sort of 5-10 years ago. Yeah. But I think one of the things that you get on the web is this immediacy and this connectivity in this network, that the same person who's programming the audio application can immediately build something that does kind of real synchronized clients across the network.
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me is that even 5 years ago, we would have never guessed the kind of collaborations that we now do with Google Docs. So I think it's really hard to look at what you have now and try and project what the future looks like, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you ask someone to give up Microsoft Excel for a Google spreadsheet, like a lot of people say, well, I can't do all the things I want to do in it, but suddenly everyone starts moving towards the Google spreadsheets because you can just send a link to a colleague and they can go and fix a thing, and the benefits of that kind of far outweigh some of the functionality that you lose, and
right.
And as more and more people use it and get this network effect, then it makes sense to making things better. And so yeah, I mean, never say never with this stuff. I think there's, ultimately with a web browser, we're running a kind of a virtual machine inside an operating system, and there's going to be some physical limits to like how much latency you can squeeze out of an environment like that without completely rewriting it and sort of changing the security models of how browsers work, and that will be that will probably provide a sort of a lower limit on what's possible.
Right.
But I think that takes you an awful long way.
Yeah, I do like the idea of never say never, though, because it is pretty amazing what we've seen already. So one last question for people. I mean, as reasonable as it is to look at JavaScript as sort of like a simplified language to work with, that still is something that people aren't necessarily super comfortable with. Is there anything that's sort of along the lines of PD and Max MSP, or any sort of like graphical interface that allows you to play with the web audio or the web MIDI systems without necessarily having to crack open a code editor?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of projects like that. There are a couple of projects, but I would say don't be scared to crack open the editor and have a go. I can really recommend a tool called Web Audio School, which is by Matt McKegg. If you Google Web Audio School, you kind of it takes you through a very nice guided series of lessons where you have a nice introduction to a concept, like let's make some sound, sort of a hello world, or play a pitched sawtooth wave. And you kind of get an introduction to this concept. You have a little editor on the side. You don't have to install any software or worry about, connecting an editor to your browser. You can just write the code directly there in the browser. And your goal in this project is to try and recreate the sound that you can hear. So you play a sound, it will give you an example, and then you write a little bit of code or change a little bit of code that they've given you, make a small change, and then you hit play and you can hear that change. And so this gives you a very nice kind of graduated introduction without any overhead. You just go to the website and start learning and work your way through this series of lessons. And when you've kind of done that, I think you can realize that some of the things that you would do with drag and drop and modulating a parameter and so on in something like Max are like very, very terse. A single line of code will connect one node to another. And if you want to chain multiple nodes, you can just keep chaining the method calls and so on. And then the browsers themselves, so particularly Firefox, have in the web tools that you get, like the developer tools that you get with the browser, there's a nice web audio inspector which lets you visualize the graph of nodes that you've built. You can click and edit some of the parameters to see what it sounds like, and you can kind of debug and play around with the graph that you've built, like within those editing tools. So that's very exciting. Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, just a side note, our time is already up, so I'm going to wrap it up.
Sure.
We'll say goodbye, but stay on the line just for a little follow-up, okay?
Of course.
Well, Chris, that's an amazing overview, and it just, again, makes me want to run out there and do some more digging, as well as going through the archives of your newsletter. Can you just really quickly give us the website for your blog and newsletter?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Chris Lowis, Lowis, and so my website is chrislowis.co.uk. And there's kind of a link there to Web Audio Weekly, which is a newsletter. Right, you can subscribe to get it by email or read it online. And I think if you're interested in web audio, then there's a jumping off points there. But like I said, try the Web Audio School to get a really nice introduction into it. And then the Mozilla Developer Network do some amazing tutorials and things on there that are kind of crowdsourced and crowd edited and take you through the API in a lot more detail and get you up and running.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it. You have a great evening.
You too, Darwin. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Bye-bye. Okay, many thanks to Chris for spending some time getting us all into and up to speed on the world of JavaScript and the Web Audio API and also the Web MIDI API as well. Some really exciting stuff there. If you have a chance, you're going to want to check out that Web Audio School. I tried it out myself, and it's pretty amazing. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to hope that you are going to continue listening. Make sure you let other people know about this. And make sure you check out some of those the back catalog, because there's some really neat stuff there as well. Other than that, I'll catch you later. Bye.